Now let's take a look at how to control shadows for standard lights within 3ds Max. Now I have this basic scene here, and we have one spotlight in the scene. Now this spotlight is not currently casting shadows, and that's one of the great things about computer graphics and 3ds Max as well, is that you don't have to have shadows on every light, and it makes lighting and rendering your scene that much more controllable. So each light in 3ds Max can have shadows on or off. Now this light currently has the shadows off. So all we have to do is go down here in the Modify panel and turn shadows on. And as you can see, we've got some shadows on our scene. Now if I keep that light selected, let's go through some of the shadow parameters for that light. The first one is the actual color of the shadow. So right now I have a black shadow, but if I want to, I can turn up the value and make that shadow a little bit more gray. Now if I move this viewport just a little bit, it will update, and there we go. And there's a little bit more of a gray shadow. Now if I want to, I could turn this really to any color I want. So if I wanted, say, purple shadows, I could certainly do that. And as you can see, the shadows change color. Now I'm going to go ahead and put these back to black. Now we can also change the density of the shadow. Right now we have a very black shadow, but if we turn down the density, it will give it a little bit more transparency. So it'll be more like we have some ambient light in the room for this shadow. And as you can see, when I've turned down the density, notice how that shadow becomes a little bit more transparent, a little less black. And again, I'm going to go ahead and put that back to 1. Now we can use an image map for the shadow, and we can also have the color of the light affect the shadow color. Now we're currently using what's called a shadow map. Let's scroll back up to shadows here, and you'll see we have this pull-down menu. We have a number of different types of shadows. By default, 3ds Max uses what's called a shadow map. Now this is probably the fastest way to calculate shadows, and what it does is it uses a bitmap to create the illusion of a shadow. Now when you have shadow map selected, we can go down here to shadow map parameters, and we can affect how that shadow looks. We have two basic controls. We have the size of that bitmap, and then the sample range. And you can think of that as a blur control. So if the size of the bitmap goes down, let's put it at something really low, say 64. You can see how this shadow gets very blurry. But if I take this sample range down all the way, you'll see that the blurring of the shadow has been turned off. And you can kind of see how we're getting this kind of jagged edge. And that's actually the pixels in that 64-bit bitmap. Now, if I turn up the sample range, notice how it gets blurrier. So let's go ahead and put this, say, at 3. And that gives me a pretty blurry shadow. But if I want a more accurate shadow, I can turn up the size of this. So we had this at 512, and notice how this gives a much sharper shadow. So if I double that to 1024, it gets even sharper. Now in order to blur this, I need a higher sample range. So if I bring it up to, say, 8 or 9, then you can see how the shadow's getting a little blurrier. So with bitmap shadows, we have two main parameters: the size of the bitmap and then the sample range, which blurs that bitmap. Now let's go and take a look at some other types of shadows. We have two types of ray trace shadows. We have a basic and an advanced ray trace shadow. So when I go over to ray trace shadows, notice how the shadows become very, very sharp. And that's because ray tracing basically shoots rays of light through the scene, and it gives you a very sharp edge. Now, ray trace shadows are great if you're using transparencies because they will cast semi-transparent shadows. Now I'm going to change this over to advanced ray trace shadows. And let's go into the advanced ray trace parameters rollout. So we have a number of basic options. We can do a 2-pass with anti-aliasing, which is the highest quality. We can create a higher or lower shadow integrity. Now, the more integrity and quality that we have, the longer it will take to render. Now we can also create a higher shadow spread and a higher jitter amount. Now this will soften the edge of the shadow. So if we put this, say, up to, say, 32 and bring the jitter up to, say, 5 or 6, we should get a fairly blurry shadow. Now in addition to this, we also have what are called area shadows. And we also have Mental Ray Shadow Map. So if you're using Mental Ray, it has its own controls for the map that you use for that. If we go into Mental Ray Shadow Map, you can see we still have a map size and a range as well as a number of samples, but it works a little bit differently than the standard shadow in 3ds Max. So as you can see, there are a number of ways to create and calculate shadows in 3ds Max. The two main types of shadows are bitmap shadows and ray trace.